Book 2, Chapter 9, on the virtue of prudence of the most holy Queen of Heaven. Just as the intellect precedes the will in its operations and directs it in its own actions, so too are the virtues that pertain to the intellect prior to those of the will. And although the function of the intellect is to know and understand truth, and for this reason one might doubt whether its habits can be called virtues, whose nature consists in inclining toward and doing what is good, it is certain that there are also intellectual virtues, whose operations are praiseworthy and good, when they are regulated by reason and truth, which the intellect recognizes as its proper good. And when this good is proposed to the will for it to desire, and when the intellect provides rules for its attainment, then the act of the intellect becomes good and virtuous, whether in the theological order, like faith, or the moral order, like prudence, which directs and governs the operations of the appetites. For this reason, the virtue of prudence is first and belongs to the intellect. It is like the root of the other moral and cardinal virtues, whose operations are praiseworthy when guided by prudence and blameworthy without it. The sovereign Queen Mary possessed this virtue of prudence in the highest degree, proportionate to that of the other virtues which I have already spoken of and will describe further. Because of the excellence of this virtue, the Church calls her the most prudent Virgin. Since this first virtue is the one that governs, directs, and commands all the works of the other virtues, and because this entire history concerns the works performed by Most Holy Mary, the whole discourse will be filled with what little I can say and write about this ocean of prudence, for in all her works the light of this virtue shone forth, guiding them. Therefore, I will now speak more generally of the prudence of the Sovereign Queen, explaining it by its parts and characteristics, according to the common teaching of doctors and saints, so that it may be better understood. Of the three kinds of prudence, political prudence, purgative prudence, and the prudence of the purified or perfected soul, not one was lacking in our Queen in the highest degree. For although her faculties were completely purified, or rather, they had no need of purification from sin or contradiction to virtue, they still had to be purified of natural ignorance, and she had to progress from good and holy to more perfect and most holy. This is to be understood in relation to her own works, and by comparing them with one another, not with the works of other creatures. For in comparison with other saints, there was no less perfect work in this city of God, whose foundations are on the holy mountains. Psalms 86 verse 1. But within herself, as she grew from the instant of her conception in charity and grace, some of her works, though absolutely perfect and surpassing all those of the saints, were less perfect in comparison to other higher works to which she later ascended. Political prudence, in general, is the kind that considers and weighs everything that ought to be done, and by reducing it to reason, does nothing that is not right and good. Purgative prudence is the kind that sets aside and abstracts from all visible things to direct the heart to divine contemplation, and all that is heavenly. The prudence of the purified soul is that which contemplates the supreme good, and directs all affection toward it in order to unite and rest there, as if there were nothing else but that. All these types of prudence were present in the understanding of Most Holy Mary, to discern and know without error, and to direct and move toward the highest and most perfect actions without hesitation or delay. Never could the judgment of this sovereign lady dictate or presume anything in any matter that was not the best and most just. No one ever surpassed her, or even equaled her, in setting aside and dismissing all that is worldly and visible, in order to direct her affections toward the contemplation of divine things. And having known them as she did, through so many kinds of knowledge, she was so intimately united by love to the uncreated supreme good that nothing ever occupied or impeded her from resting in this center of her love. The components of prudence were clearly present in our Queen with supreme perfection. The first is memory, to retain past events and experiences. From these many rules can be deduced for acting in the present and future, since this virtue deals with concrete actions. And because there can be no general rule for all circumstances, it is necessary to draw many from various examples and experiences, thus requiring memory. Our sovereign queen possessed this part with such constancy that she never suffered the natural defect of forgetfulness. What she once understood and learned remained fixed and ever present in her memory. In this gift, Mary most pure surpassed all the order of human nature and even angelic nature. For in her, God made a compendium of the most perfect aspects of both. She had the essentials of human nature, and, of its accidental qualities, only what was most perfect, far from sin, and necessary for merit. Of both natural and supernatural angelic gifts, she possessed many by special grace, and to a higher degree than the angels themselves. One of these gifts was a steadfast, unerring memory. She could not forget what she had once learned. And just as she exceeded the angels in prudence, so too did she excel them in this aspect of memory. In only one matter was this benefit mysteriously limited by the humble purity of Most Holy Mary. Since her memory was to retain the species of all things, and among them it was inevitable that she should know many vile and sinful actions of creatures, the most humble and pure princess begged the Lord that this gift of memory not extend to preserving these images, except insofar as was necessary for the exercise of fraternal charity and other virtues. The Most High granted her this petition, more as a testimony to her spotless humility than from any danger to her, for filth does not defile the sun's rays, nor are the angels disturbed by our vileness, for to the pure all things are pure. But in this favor the Lord privileged his mother above even the angels, preserving in her memory only the images of all that was holy, honest, pure, and most pleasing to her purity and to the Lord himself. With this, her most holy soul was even more beautiful and adorned in her memory with all that was most pure and desirable. Another part of prudence is called understanding, which chiefly regards what should be done in the present moment. It consists in deeply and truly comprehending the certain principles and truths of virtuous acts, so as to perform them, deducing their execution from this understanding, both in the general perception of virtue and in its specific application, such as, do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself. Therefore, if I have a deep understanding of this truth, I must not harm this brother in any particular way that I would find unjust if done to me. Most Holy Mary possessed this understanding in so much higher a degree than all other creatures, as she knew more moral truths, and penetrated them more deeply, with an infallible rectitude and divine participation. In that most luminous intellect, filled with the greatest splendors of divine light, there was no error, ignorance, or doubt, no mere opinions as in other creatures. She grasped all truths, especially in the practical matters of virtue, both generally and particularly, as they truly are, and in this incomparable degree she possessed this part of prudence. The third part is foresight or providence, which is the principal among the parts of prudence, because the most important aspect of directing human actions is to order the present toward the future, so that everything is rightly governed. This is what foresight does. Our Queen and Lady had this part of prudence in a more excellent degree, if such were possible, than all the others. In addition to the memory of the past and deep understanding of the present, she possessed certain and infallible knowledge of many future events, extending her foresight with prudence. With this infused light and knowledge, she so prepared for the future and arranged all outcomes that nothing ever surprised her or took her unaware. All things were foreseen, considered, and weighed on the scales of the sanctuary of her mind, illuminated with divine light. And thus she awaited all events with certainty, not with doubt or uncertainty like the rest of mankind. Everything she encountered had its proper place, time, and opportunity, so that all was governed well. These three parts of prudence correspond to the three divisions of time, past, present, and future, governing the intellect's operations through this virtue. But when we consider all the operations of prudence, in how it identifies the means of the other virtues, and directs the operations of the will, the doctors and philosophers add 5 more components to prudence: teachableness, reasoning, shrewdness, circumspection, and caution. Docility is the willingness to be taught by those wiser, not relying on one's own judgment or wisdom. Reasoning consists in drawing correct conclusions from general principles to apply them to particular virtuous actions. Shrewdness is the diligent attentiveness and mindfulness of everything that happens, just as docility relates to what we are taught in order to make sound judgments and find rules for proper conduct. Circumspection is the judgment and consideration of the circumstances that a virtuous act must have, for a good end is not enough to make an action praiseworthy if it lacks the appropriate circumstances or timing. Caution refers to the careful attention with which dangers or hindrances, whether disguised as virtue or unexpected, must be noticed and avoided so that we are not caught off guard or unprepared. All of these parts of prudence were found in the Queen of Heaven without any defect and with ultimate perfection. Docility in her majesty was a legitimate daughter of her incomparable humility. For although she received the fullness of knowledge from the first moment of her immaculate conception, and although she was the teacher and mother of true wisdom, she always allowed herself to be taught by superiors, equals, and even inferiors, regarding herself as less than all, and desiring to be the disciple of those who, in comparison to her, were most ignorant. She exhibited this docility her entire life like a most innocent dove, veiling her wisdom with greater prudence than the serpents. Cf. Mate 1016. She allowed herself to be taught by her parents as a child, by her teacher in the temple, by her companions, by her husband Joseph, by the apostles, and wished to learn from all creatures so as to be a wondrous example of this virtue and of humility. As I have said elsewhere, cf. above and 405, 472. The prudential reasoning of Most Holy Mary is reflected in what the evangelist St. Luke repeatedly says of her, Luke 2 verses 19 and 51, that she kept all things in her heart and pondered them. This pondering appears to be the work of reason, comparing earlier events with those that followed, and reflecting upon them internally to form the most prudent counsels, and apply them with perfect accuracy. And although she knew many things without discourse, and with a most simple act of understanding that surpassed all human reasoning, nevertheless, regarding the works she had to perform in virtue, she was able to reason and apply the general principles of virtue to her own actions. In shrewdness and diligent attentiveness, another part of prudence, the sovereign lady was also highly privileged. Because she was free of the heavy weight of passions and corruption, she never experienced weakness or sluggishness in her faculties. Rather, she was agile, prompt, and perfectly equipped to take note of and attend to everything that might help her make sound judgments and offer wise counsel in practicing virtue in whatever situation arose. She responded swiftly and accurately to what virtue required. In circumspection, Most Holy Mary was equally admirable, for all her actions were so complete that none lacked a good circumstance, and all possessed the best possible qualities to elevate them. Since the majority of her actions were ordered toward charity for her neighbor, and all were timely, her teaching, consoling, admonishing, praying, and correcting always conveyed a sweet efficacy in her words and a pleasing effect in her deeds. The final part, caution, which helps recognize and avoid dangers that may hinder or destroy virtue, had to be present in the Queen of Angels more perfectly than even in the angels themselves. Her sublime wisdom and corresponding love made her so cautious and alert that no event or obstacle ever caught her unaware. She always evaded them and acted with supreme perfection in all virtues. Since the enemy, as I will explain later, cf. Infra Part 2, N 353, was constantly trying to hinder her through strange and subtle traps, the most prudent virgin exercised this part of caution many times in ways that astonished all the angels. From this cautious discernment of Most Holy Mary, the devil developed a fearful rage and envy, longing to know the power by which she destroyed so many of his plots and deceptions. He was always frustrated, because the Lady of Virtues always acted with the utmost perfection in every matter and occasion. Having now considered the parts that make up prudence, we may speak of its various types, categorized according to their objects and goals. Since prudence governs both oneself and others, it is divided accordingly. The kind that serves each person for governing their own actions is called enarchic. There is little more to say about this beyond what was already discussed regarding the Queen of Heaven's self-governance. The kind that teaches the governance of others is called polyarchic, and this is further divided into 4 types, according to the diverse responsibilities of governing different groups. The first is regnative prudence, which teaches how to rule kingdoms with just and necessary laws, and is proper to kings, princes, and monarchs, or those with supreme power. The second is political prudence, which governs cities or republics. The third is economic prudence, which instructs the domestic management of families and households. The fourth is military prudence, which teaches the conduct of war and armies. None of these kinds of prudence were lacking in our great queen. She received all of them as infused habits at the moment of her immaculate conception and sanctification, so that no grace, virtue, or perfection would be missing in her that could elevate and adorn her above all creatures. The Most High formed her to be the treasury and storehouse of all his gifts, the exemplar for all creation, and the perfect manifestation of his power and greatness, so that the heavenly Jerusalem might clearly recognize what God could and would accomplish in a pure creature. These habits of prudence were not idle in Most Holy Mary. She exercised them throughout her life on many occasions. Regarding economic prudence, it is well known how incomparable hers was in governing her household with her husband Joseph and her Most Holy Son, in whose education and care she proceeded with the exact prudence required by the highest and most hidden sacrament God entrusted to any creature. I will say what I understand and can about this in its proper place, cf. Infra Part 2, and 653, 663, 702, 711. She exercised regnative or monarchical prudence as the unique empress of the Church, teaching, advising, and governing the holy apostles in the early Church to help establish the laws, rites, and ceremonies most necessary and appropriate for its propagation and stability. Though she obeyed them in particular matters, and consulted especially with St. Peter as Christ's vicar and head, and with St. John as her spiritual guardian, nonetheless, they and the others consulted her and obeyed her in general matters and in other aspects of the Church's governance. She also advised kings and Christian princes who sought her counsel, for many sought her out after the ascension of her Most Holy Son, cf. Infra Part 2, N. 567, Part 3, N. 587, 588. Most notably, the 3 wise men consulted her when they came to adore the child Jesus. She answered them, and taught them everything they needed to know regarding the governance of their own kingdoms, with such wisdom and insight that she became their star and guide, pointing them toward the path of eternity. They returned to their countries enlightened, consoled, and amazed at the wisdom, prudence, and sweet power of the words they had heard from a tender maiden. To confirm all that might be said of this, we need only listen to the words of the Queen herself. By me kings reign, and princes rule, and the lawmakers judge rightly. Neither was the political prudence lacking in her. She instructed republics and communities, especially among the early faithful, on how to conduct their public affairs and governance, and how to obey kings and temporal rulers, and especially how to submit to the vicar of Christ and head of the Church, as well as their prelates and bishops. She also guided the proper disposition of councils, their definitions, and the decrees issued therein. Military prudence likewise found a place in the sovereign queen. For some of the faithful consulted her about this as well, and she advised and taught them how to conduct just wars against their enemies in a manner most just and pleasing to the Lord. And in this context, one could include the courageous spirit and prudence with which this powerful lady vanquished the Prince of Darkness and taught how to wage war against him with supreme wisdom and prudence, better than David against Goliath, Judith against Holofernes, or Esther against Haman. And even if all these acts did not require those specific types and habits of prudence in the Mother of Wisdom, it was fitting for her to possess them all, not only as adornments of her most holy soul, but also because she was the singular mediatrix and advocate of the world, since she was to petition for every grace that God would grant to mortals, and since nothing would be given except through her hand and intercession, it was necessary that she possess knowledge and perfect understanding of the virtues she asked for on behalf of mortals. All was to flow from this lady as from the original source after God himself, in whom all things exist as in their uncreated origin. Other elements are also attributed to prudence, so-called potential parts, which serve as its instruments. These include synesis, or good judgment in discerning what is appropriate, eubulia, or the virtue that forms good counsel, or the ability to judge when to go beyond ordinary rules, especially necessary for epieikeia, which applies higher principles in exceptional cases. All of these perfections and strengths belong to the prudence of Most Holy Mary. No one like her ever formed such sound counsel for all contingent matters, nor could anyone, even the highest angel, pass such correct judgment in every case. Above all, our most prudent queen reached the highest principles and rules of action in matters where ordinary laws could not apply. To detail them all would take too long. Many will be made evident in the account of her holy life. To conclude this whole discourse on her prudence, let the measure by which it is judged be the prudence of the most holy soul of Christ our Lord, to whom she conformed and assimilated herself in every way, being formed as his helper and companion, in all the works of the highest prudence and wisdom accomplished by the Lord and Redeemer of the world. Doctrine of the Queen of Heaven. My daughter, everything you have written in this chapter, and all you have understood, I wish you to keep as doctrine and instruction for the governance of all your actions. Write it upon your mind, and keep the memory of the knowledge given you about my prudence in all that I thought, desired, and did, for this light will guide you amid the darkness of human ignorance, so that you may not be confused or troubled by the deceptions of the passions, or, worse still, by the cunning and tireless efforts of your enemies, who labor to influence your understanding. It is not blameworthy for a creature to lack knowledge of every rule of prudence, but to be negligent in acquiring them, so as to be properly attentive in all things, is a grave fault and the cause of many errors and misdeeds. From such negligence, the passions run wild, destroying and hindering prudence, especially disordered sorrow and pleasure, which corrupt right judgment and prudent discernment of good and evil. From this arise two dangerous vices: precipitance, acting rashly without sound means, and inconstancy in good resolutions and undertakings. Unrestrained anger and indiscreet zeal both lead to rash and immoderate actions. A weak judgment and lack of firmness in the good cause the soul to abandon what it began imprudently, readily drawn now to true good, and soon after to its apparent deceptive imitation, driven by passions and the illusions presented by the devil. Against all these dangers, I want you to be vigilant and prudent. You will succeed if you keep before you the example of my actions, and preserve the teachings and counsels of obedience to your spiritual directors, without which you must do nothing if you wish to act with counsel and docility. Know that the Most High will communicate abundant wisdom to you through such obedience, for he is especially moved by a heart that is humble, yielding, and docile. Always remember the misfortune of the foolish and imprudent virgins, Matthew 25 verses 1 and 13, who, through heedless negligence, failed to seek counsel and due care when they should have, and later, when they sought help, found the door to be closed. Strive, my daughter, with the simplicity of the dove, to unite the prudence of the serpent, Matthew 10 verse 16, and your actions will be perfect,